VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Well, thank you for joining us on Crosstalk today here on VCY America. Ladies and gentlemen, it may sound like science fiction to you, but recently, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, stated this: artificial intelligence has the potential to accelerate progress toward a dignified life in peace and prosperity for all people. The time has arrived for all of us, governments, industry, and civil society to consider how artificial intelligence will affect our future. What is this artificial intelligence promoted? Who is going to control it? What ideals will it espouse? And what is the intent to promote the United Nations Agenda 2030? Well, joining us to address these issues, we welcome back Alex Newman, an international freelance journalist, educator, and consultant. As a freelance journalist, he writes for The New American, and he is co-author of the book Crimes of the Educators. Alex, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. It's always a pleasure.
It indeed sounds like science fiction to me, but the UN actually held a global summit in Geneva, June 2017, on artificial intelligence, saying artificial intelligence will change the way we shape our world. Alex, if you would provide us the backstory to this.
Sure. Well, thanks again for the opportunity, Jim. And, the global press was really missing in action, if you will, on this story. I mean, this is a huge story. This may be one of the most important stories of the century or even human history, because what we're dealing with here with artificial intelligence is these supercomputers that have the ability to learn on their own, to process information in a way that has never occurred before in human history and is just unprecedented. And so the potential of this technology is just, I think, beyond anything that any of us can fathom. We're talking about here computers that can make autonomous decisions, that can educate themselves, and that, of course, are originally going to be programmed by people who have, all the fallen human beings who have all the same biases and prejudices and impulses and all the rest of it as, any other people do. So this is, just a massive development, incredible development. We've seen a little bit of information trickling out here and there about, well, is a robot going to replace your job? That may well happen. There are already robots writing news stories, and actually they're pretty well written. So, eventually we journalists may be out of a job. But this emergence of artificial intelligence, somewhere within the next 5 to, say, 20, 30, 40 years, these computers are going to be, if current trends continue, are going to be smarter than human beings. I mean, at some point, they're going to be so much smarter than human beings, assuming nothing happens in the interim, that, I don't think people can fathom this. So to have the United Nations, the premier international organization where virtually every national government and dictator in the world is represented, come together in Geneva to have this huge summit discussing artificial intelligence and how it can be used and exploited to advance the UN's agenda, in particular the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals that we'll get into. This is a massive story, and yet there was virtually nothing about it said in the international press, with a handful of exceptions, especially, a couple of technology blogs talked about it. Now, it wasn't a secret summit. People can watch some of the videos of some of the speeches that were made. They can watch the Secretary General of the United Nations, a proud socialist, introducing the conference and talking about some of the implications. But so they came together in Geneva last month under the auspices of the UN International Telecommunications Union. For people who are not familiar with the UN bureaucracy and that agency in particular, this is actually the agency that has been selected, if you will, by the UN, by its member governments, to take the lead on the regulation, taxation, and censorship of the Internet. And so, not coincidentally, they actually have a communist Chinese agent. His name is Haolin Zhao, and, definite Communist Party member from China, served many, many decades in the Communist Party's bureaucracy in China. And so he's the one who's running this bureaucracy that convened this global gathering on artificial intelligence. It was called AI for Good Global Summit. So, they want us to believe that they're going to use this technology for good. Mm-hmm. But if their track record's anything to go on, I think we have a lot to worry about here.
Yeah, and in your article, and this is how we learned about it, was through your writing on it, and then I saw links that take us directly to the UN site. So you're right, they were not secretive about this. They're very forthright in this, but coverage of this has been, in any sort of global media, has been lacking. You indicate that the UN is actually plotting with both big business and big government to exploit this artificial intelligence to further its agenda. What big business are you speaking of? What big government are you speaking of?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jim. And here's another, incredibly important angle to this story. A real journalist could have gone there and pumped out 100 stories, no problem, if they had the time and the resources and the means for this, because there was just so much going on. But some of the big businesses that were brought into this, they sent very high-level representatives to speak and participate and to be involved in this whole process. That includes Google, which is just an incredibly powerful corporation. Mm-hmm. They can literally control what the overwhelming majority of the American people see as far as information goes when they're searching for stuff on the Internet. So this is an incredibly powerful company, and they were represented. Of course, Facebook was as well, Microsoft, and a lot of these big technology companies. And again, we don't have to speculate about their agenda, about their proclivities. They announced very proudly that they were working with the European Union to censor the Internet. They say they don't want extremist content and hate content, and by that they mean things like defending, for example, biblical marriage, right? Just citing scripture on marriage is enough to get you in trouble for hate speech in a lot of European countries and under European laws. And, to have all these mega corporations jumping in bed with the United Nations, with the European Union, I think people just need to project the lines here. These are very serious developments. People should at least be aware of these things, and yet nobody's talking about it.
Alex, this whole ideology of the UN, and you mentioned the term sustainable development, and you've been with us before, you've discussed the topic before, but I think it would be good, just so we have proper context, in a nutshell, define what is meant by sustainable development.
Sure. Well, again, this is another incredibly important question that's not being talked about, unfortunately. If you ask your regular, everyday, run-of-the-mill bureaucrat working for the UN or for, any national government, and I've done this. I've gone to a lot of the UN's conferences on global warming, and I was down at their UN conference on sustainable development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. So I asked all kinds of people, ranging from presidents and national leaders and dictators down to lowly bureaucrats in charge of implementing these decisions. What do you mean by sustainable development? And surprise, you'll never get the same answer twice. Right? They all have a different, talking point that they want to emphasize regarding what sustainable development is. But I think the simplest answer for people who want to find out about this, ignore the fact that the UN Conference on Sustainable Development was chaired by an actual anti-American Chinese communist, Xia Zhakun, and just look at the documents that these people are producing. Agenda 2030 is the most recent and perhaps the most important example, and this is available online. Anybody can read about it. We've discussed it on this show before, and I've written a good number of articles about it. And, I can just pick a few key points from there to illustrate for people what we're talking about here. For example, they talk about that wealth inequality and income inequality within and among nations needs to be reduced, and of course the UN is going to be the mechanism to do that. So what they're saying is that national socialism, national wealth redistribution is no longer enough. Now we need global wealth redistribution. And so what they're actually talking about is taking money from the poor and the middle class in places like the United States and Canada and Western Europe and Japan and redistributing this to the United Nations and the dictatorships that have kept the Third World largely in poverty today. They talk about our children, and this is the exact term they use, critical agents of change to advance the sustainable development ideology. They have a whole section on education, goal number 4, where they say that all students, it's not just that they have to learn to accept sustainable development or submit to sustainable development. It actually says, and this is the same wording from the document, that they need to be trained to promote sustainable development. So I think the best way to understand the term sustainable development is anti-human, totalitarian. Basically take what God said in the book of Genesis, be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, all the rest of it, and flip it on its head, and then you have a good idea of what they're talking about.
Wow. And so therefore, I'm surmising when and you use a term that they say this is for the global good, So how I would define the global good with the biblical worldview in mind, and what they mean by a global good, I think we're going to have two different definitions here, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. I would argue that we're essentially talking about opposite visions about what is global good. Mm-hmm. If you're a Christian, if you believe the Bible, if you have a biblical worldview, you think it's good when people have babies and have farms and own private property, right? God said, "Thou shalt not steal." So we believe in private property. Mm-hmm. When the UN talks about global good, they mean the opposite of those things, and they tell you this, right? They want to reduce the population. They want to erode private property rights. They want to take your wealth and redistribute it. And so really we're talking about completely, I think, opposite visions is the best way to describe it. And, they like to pretend like they speak for the whole world because every, national government and dictator essentially is a member. But, people like us really do not have much representation in the United Nations, unfortunately.
Alex Newman is our guest here today on Crosstalk, and we're speaking of the UN promoting artificial intelligence to advance its goals. Now, I was looking at some of the quotes from the Secretary General, and I thought he used terms like serious challenges, and there are ethical issues here. It appears, understands the power that such artificial intelligence can have, that it could be either used for good or for ill.
Absolutely. And, that was actually a fairly frequent topic of discussion, because I think anybody who has looked at this realizes that the potential for evil here is just off the charts. I mean, we're dealing with a technology that makes nuclear bombs look like, child's firecrackers. This stuff has the potential to completely reshape everything about what we think of, being human, of life on this planet. And if it were to fall into the wrong hands, you can imagine how disastrous this might be. And, you can go back and think of the movies, from the 80s and 90s, the sci-fi stuff, a RoboCop, whatever. I never saw it, but apparently an artificial intelligence thing sends a robot around and kills people. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that could become a reality within our lifetimes. And so that was one of the frequent topics of discussion. Well, how do we make sure this doesn't fall into the wrong hands, right? And the implicit assumption is that the UN is the right hands and everybody else is the wrong hands. Mm-hmm. And so they use this as an excuse to further empower themselves, right? They say, well, if the UN doesn't control all this, then, it might turn into a disaster, and therefore we need global laws, global regulations, global rules to protect us from this threat of, artificial intelligence falling into the wrong hands. But what if the UN is the wrong hands? Well, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, and you actually indicate that the UN is even seeking to hire an artificial intelligence advisor. What do we know about this?
It's posted right on their website. You can go on the UN Ops website. If you know anything about artificial intelligence, you might submit a resume. But, they tell you right there. They want this artificial intelligence advisor to help the UN harness the power of artificial intelligence to advance its objectives. And again, we just went through a few of its objectives as they're listed in Agenda 2030, and they make numerous references to using artificial intelligence to advance Agenda 2030. And so I think this all needs to be understood in the greater context. So the UN has an agenda. They've told us what their agenda is, and they want AI to advance it.
We're going to take a quick break. Folks, this is almost overwhelming to hear this information because of the fact that this has been going on. A summit held on this just in June 2017. The UN wanting artificial intelligence to advance their agenda. We'll be back to discuss it further after the break. This is Crosstalk.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation researcher with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, has evolution actually been observed?
Chris, we have to define our terms carefully. Evolution in the larger sense definitely has not been observed. We've never seen one type of animal change into another. Now, we've seen a lot of adaptations, and a lot of mutations and genetic recombinations, but these are not evolutionary changes. They merely manipulate things that are already there. Evolution means new genes, new traits, new body parts. Usually evolutionists say, well, it goes too slow to observe. Well, okay, we certainly don't observe it. Now, we do see adaptation, we see variety, but we don't see evolution, not in the meaningful sense. And that's because evolution simply doesn't happen. Living things got here by creation. And we can read all about that when we go back to Genesis.
For more information, you can find us on the web at www.icr.org.
Friends, you don't have to look too far. It's right on the United Nations website where you can get information about the conference. Our guest today has written about it. I've not been seeing writings on this, but Alex Newman has delved into it. The UN wants artificial intelligence to advance agenda. And Alex, I understand that's available at the New American?
Yes, this article in particular, you can find it at www.thenewamerican. If it's not on the landing page anymore, you can just click on that top bar, Science and Technology, click there, and it should pop right up.
Great. And as I look at this agenda that was part of this AI conference, this agenda, and you write on this in your article, you say the agenda was bold. AI innovation will be central to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, will help solving humanity's grand challenges by capitalizing on the unprecedented quantities of data now being generated on sentiment behavior, human health, commerce, communications, migration, and more. They want to accelerate and advance the development. And, as I look at this, they're talking dealing with poverty, hunger, health, education, the environment. I mean, this is really, really all-encompassing, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting. The ITU, actually, the International Telecommunications Agency, run by, again, actual Chinese communists, they have an official blog, and they go into a little bit how might we use AI artificial intelligence, to advance this Agenda 2030. And they give you a little blurb on each one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that they have. And people ought to take a look here, because it's really revealing. They talk about using AI to, what's the exact word, allocate resources to help deal with poverty. We've seen this kind of rhetoric many, many times over the last 100 years. Every single time, without exception, when these ideas have been fully implemented, it's ended in massive tragedy, mass murder, terror to enforce the decrees, starvation, deaths from preventable diseases because of shortages due to central planning. So the idea is basically, the human beings who were doing the central planning, they were flawed. They couldn't possibly do all these calculations. But now that we have artificial intelligence, we can now have everything kind of be centrally planned, and, the computers can allocate resources for us, and that'll make everything just fine and dandy. And, of course, we know that that's not true, but that's exactly the line that they're pushing.
You use the term technocracy. What do you mean by that?
I was first introduced to this term last year, actually, by a gentleman named Patrick Wood. He wrote a book called Technocracy Rising. And, at first it was just intriguing. But when I started looking into it, what he discovered was that there was a movement almost 100 years ago in the United States. It had almost completely been forgotten by history, but at one point it was very powerful. I think they had more than 100,000 members pushing for this. And the idea is that we have this scientific management of society. And so, engineers and scientists and technocrats make all of our decisions for us and do all of the central planning. And, there are people still openly pushing for these kinds of ideas. If you look, for example, at the Zeitgeist Project and the Venus Project, this is very much along the lines of what they're promoting, and they got very popular. But essentially it means the idea of, surrendering self-government, surrendering individual liberties to this all-powerful kind of governing class of technocrats that would make our decisions for us. And what the UN appears to be pushing is a kind of technocracy aided by artificial intelligence and supercomputers that would, theoretically at least, take good care of us and make us peaceful and keep us fed and all the rest of it.
And you also refer to a dictators club that would control this. Who is this dictators club? Who's part of this?
Well, that's a term I've been using for years now to describe the United Nations, because I challenge anybody to go through the membership roster of the UN and tell me, would you like these people to make decisions over your life for you? You have the mass murdering dictatorship in China has murdered more people than any government in human history. They still relentlessly persecute Christians, as long as they're if they're outside of the state-run, the state-controlled churches. We have communist dictators in Cuba and Vietnam, the socialist regime in Venezuela. We have the Islamist regime in Saudi Arabia that likes to chop off heads from apostates, people who convert to Christianity. So, would you really want to be governed by these people? Do you want these people making decisions over the lives of your children and your grandchildren? I think Dictators Club is a very appropriate term to describe this United Nations. And granted, not all of them are dictatorships. Some of them have, some of them are rather free countries to some extent, and others are, corrupt dictatorships and corrupt, supposed democracies. But either way, there's so many unsavory governments here that people need to think about that when they think of the UN. They think of this kumbaya, everybody's going to hold hands and we're all going to live in peace. These aren't the people who are represented in the UN. This is the governments and the dictators ruling over those people.
There's another term here that is all part of this artificial intelligence, and it's really tied into this. It's called predictive modeling, and I think this is an important component to explain to the listeners as well.
I think it is crucial that people understand this. They want the artificial intelligence to be able to, and actually the Secretary General and some of the others talked about using artificial intelligence to prevent crime. So what they're talking about is using AI to kind of predict what will happen based on the data that's inputted into it. So, they might, for example, start predicting, well, you're likely to commit some crime in the future based on this data that the computer has acquired on you. And based on that, maybe we need to preemptively arrest you, right? And there used to be science fiction movies about that, and
right.
People thought, oh, that's crazy, wow, what a good movie. But we're moving towards that direction. And again, they're not even bothering to hide it. They're talking about this stuff openly in major international conferences.
And it's amazing as I read about this as well, this artificial intelligence is to be capable of deceiving, lying, and actually committing criminal acts itself?
Well, I reached out to Patrick Wood, the author that I mentioned who wrote the book on technocracy, and I said, what do you think about this? Have you seen this? And, what are your thoughts? And he wrote back to me with, I think, an incredibly astute comment. He said, these are machines that are created by humans, and humans we know can lie, can steal, can kill, and can do other immoral acts. And so we know for a fact that the computers these humans are making can do those same things. Now, what if these computers were so powerful that, to speak of Pandora's box, once it's out, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. Well, at that point, we have a very real problem on our hands.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And do you see a connection between this and some of the other things we've seen, such as the company in Wisconsin talking about microchipping employees or Visa's big cashless promotion, to businesses? Is there a connection between all these elements?
I think there absolutely is. I think really for the first time in human history, we can now see how some of the biblical prophecies about, the kind of end times before Christ returns, we can now see how these could be at least technologically possible for these things to come about at this point. 2,000 years ago, when John wrote some of these revelations, people must have thought, well, that's ludicrous. How could any system ever prevent people from buying or selling if they wouldn't take a mark? Well, now we see the emergence of all this incredibly powerful technology, the supercomputers, the push for abolishing cash and having everything run through computers, the push for microchipping people, which is much further along in other places. I spent a lot of time in Sweden, and this has been going on there for years. We're moving into an era where at least it's feasible, it's technologically possible that all of these things that were prophesied, 2,000 years ago almost, could realistically come about. And so people should sit up and take notice. The Bible has a lot to say about when we see some of these things coming to pass. Well, our redemption draws near, so we should be excited, but at the same time, we need to be aware of these things.
I've been in businesses, restaurants that have said we take cash only, no electronic transfers, and that's the course is going to be totally reversed on this. We're going to see where there will only be electronic transfers that are allowed, only for electronic transactions to even be accepted. If you want to do business, this is something that will be required.
Oh, and, that's the case already all over Sweden. You can go to churches and you can't donate cash anymore. You're expected to slide your card or use your smartphone. Even homeless people now, they have techno devices so that people can donate money, using their cell phone or their card or whatever. And a lot of buses will no longer take cash. A lot of stores will no longer take cash. And so it's getting to the point where if you try to operate solely on cash, your life, at least for now, is going to be very, very inconvenient. And the next step is, of course, to make it impossible. And, once that happens, again, people just should project the lines. Where does this go? Well, what happens when you become a thought criminal, right?
Yeah,
and you disagree with some of what's happening, or you don't want to participate in the system anymore? due to your religious convictions, for example. What happens at that point? People need to think about these things.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we're already seeing in different places, sentences. I think California right now is going through the issue of with the whole transgender aspect that if for the elderly who are confined in homes, that if a worker, even in Christian homes, does not choose to use the gender that the person perceives themselves to be, that you can suffer jail time or you can suffer financial penalty as a result if this legislation works its way through. But we're seeing this to crop up in different nations of the world as well. And, how long would it be before there's a knock at one's door saying, we have seen postings where you have taken positions on marriage that are in opposition to what our nation believes, or you have radical views, or you have very extreme views based upon ancient scriptures that we find you to be a threat, so therefore we have to come and arrest you.
And this is already beginning to happen all over the world. In the United States, we've been spared a lot of the most extreme parts of this. But if you look at what's happening in Western Europe, if you look at what's happening in China, if you look at even what's happening in Canada, they passed a law in Ontario recently where parents will lose their children if they refuse to be, quote-unquote, supportive of, their gender confusion or their homosexual beliefs, anything like that. So we're talking about a deliberate targeting of Christians. It's much more overt in places like China, where they literally will come knock at your door and take you away. But even in Sweden, they throw pastors in jail for quoting the Bible on marriage and homosexuality. And this is happening increasingly, even in countries that we consider free and close allies, places like Britain. Again, they're putting pastors in prison merely for holding to biblical views that have been held by people in our civilization for thousands of years. So it's getting scary.
So this whole aspect of where we see the UN going with this, and the implementation of they're wanting artificial intelligence to advance their agenda. How can we as a nation stand up and say we object? We don't want to be involved with this. I mean, this global body, they're still in New York City. How do we deal with this?
Well, I think that's a really important question. I think first and foremost, we need to be up to speed on all of these developments. If we're just watching our TV and we're just reading our local newspaper, or even worse, the Washington Post or the New York Times, we're going to have no clue what's really happening in the world. So the first step is to educate ourselves. Listen to programs like this one. Read reliable publications so that you know what's happening. As for stopping this UN agenda, I think the simplest and easiest way to do this would be to have us withdraw from the UN. There's actually a great bill in Congress right now, H.R. 193, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, and if it's passed, it will end American participation in the United Nations, no more tax money for the UN, our troops would no longer be serving under the UN, and of course we would evict the headquarters from New York City. They could go put it in, Zimbabwe or Tehran or Havana or Pyongyang, any place they like, other than U.S. soil. And, I think that would really put a big dent in this effort. It might set them back 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And it might allow America to continue flourishing for some more generations, which would, in my opinion, be a nice thing.
Again, folks, that's H.R. 193. It's to end membership of the United States in the United Nations. You can contact your members of Congress on this at 202-225-3121. That's 202-225-3121. H.R. 193, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Folks, you may think that we fell off a cliff somewhere and knocked our head and just dreamed up this information, but it is true. It is actual. You'll find it through the United Nations websites, and Alex has written about it, warning the American public. Now, if you'd like to speak with him today, if you have a question, give us a call here at Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. Our number is open, 800-733-9829. We'll be right back.
Is it important that we be aware of the signs of the times? Do Christians agree about the role of America in Bible prophecy? Is there a biblical evidence that the church will escape the tribulation period? Will only believers enter into Christ's millennial kingdom? These are just a few of the many questions addressed in the Bible Prophecy Answer book by Ron Rhodes. Whether you're looking for quick instruction or you're eager to go deeper, this book will help you navigate prophetic scripture passages to better understand matters of eternal significance. Learn about Israel's rebirth, the Ezekiel invasion, the rapture, the judgment seat of Christ, the Antichrist, Armageddon, the Great White Throne Judgment, and so much more. VCY is offering the Bible Prophecy Answer Book for a donation of $16 or 2 copies for a donation of $25 when you call 1-800-729-9829. 1-800-729-9829.
Folks, we're talking total control, computers having control, and perhaps pigeonholing you into a certain category because of what you believe, what you think, websites you visit, payments that you make, correspondence you have. Yes, the UN is promoting artificial intelligence to advance its goals. Alex Newman is with us today. He's an international freelance journalist. He's an educator. He's a consultant. He writes for The New American, and you can read the article, newamerican.com. I'd also suggest you read his book, co-author of the book Crimes of the Educators. We've interviewed him on this book here as well on Crosstalk because, Alex, children, the youth, are very much a component. They're in the crosshairs of the UN.
Oh, they absolutely are. You know, Agenda 2030 makes that explicit and perfectly clear. Again, children are referred to as critical agents of change in bringing about this UN agenda. Goal 4, if people want to be really creeped out, check out the plans they have for your children. And keep in mind as you read these things, you know, it talks about mandatory, quote-unquote, human rights education for all children. When the UN talks about human rights, they mean literally the opposite of what the founders of this country believe. You know, the founders of this country said it was a self-evident truth that God created us and gave us inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, and all the rest of it. You know, these have a biblical foundation. We have a right to property because God said, "Thou shalt not steal." We have a right to life because God said, "Thou shalt not murder." So, you know, these things are all grounded in thousands of years of Western civilization and Judeo-Christian thought. What the UN is talking about is, again, the opposite. They're talking about privileges granted to people by governments, by international instruments and organizations like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And if you read these things, they'll tell you so. I mean, go to Article 29 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and they tell you boldly that none of your rights and freedoms may ever be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So you have no rights unless the UN thinks it's okay for you to have a privilege at this moment.
And just before our lines are filled right now, but just before we pick up our first call, tell us about the Sesame Credit.
I'm so glad you brought this up. You know, the Communist Chinese government, I think a lot of people have misimpressions about it, you know, that they've reformed and that they're suddenly nice guys. And, you know, a lot of the establishment insiders and globalists, they call China now the new leader on global warming and free trade and all the rest of it. They're implementing, as we speak, this system that they call Sesame Credit. And the way it works is every citizen, and I'm not even sure that's the correct term to use, we might call them subjects or victims of the Communist Chinese government, is going to have a score. And their score is calculated using a broad range of different data and metrics. And what I think is most, you know, some of it's kind of standard stuff, you know, how credit worthy are you? Do you pay your bills on time and so on? Are you a good citizen in that respect? But a lot of it gets into just really Orwellian stuff. Have you ever expressed politically incorrect thought crimes on social media? Right? Have you ever mentioned Tiananmen Square? Oh boy, that'll cost you big on your score. Do you have any friends or family who have said things that the communist government doesn't like? If that's the case, your score will go down. And so every citizen is going to have a score. And again, this is already happening. This isn't some hypothetical future development. And these scores are going to determine all sorts of things, including whether you can leave the country, whether you can pursue a higher education, whether you can get a loan, whether you can, have children and raise children and have certain freedoms. So, you know, this is an incredibly Orwellian model. I think Orwell couldn't even conceive of something that's totalitarian, and yet it's happening right now in the most populous nation in the world that has incredible influence in the United Nations that we've been talking about. People need to be aware of these things.
Let's go to Lat, calling from Racine, Wisconsin. Lat, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi, Jim. Hi, Alex. Do you think through this artificial intelligence, through the UN, that they could possibly use this to explore things like in artificial intelligence to make robots to possibly use in the military as like actually soldiers, where if the economy broke down later, that our own military wouldn't go against the Constitution, that these robots could be killing machines to control the masses. Do you think that's possible? And I'll go off the air. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to the caller, and I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that is absolutely plausible, that is absolutely realistic. We already know that militaries all over the world, especially the Communist Chinese government, but even our government, is investing in artificial intelligence and robotic soldiers, right? Killing machines that would be able to make their own decisions, right? I mean, if you look on YouTube, you can already see these videos of, swarms of drones armed with guns flying around, in formation. And people think about this and they say, oh, that's silly, that's kooky, that's science fiction stuff from the 70s. But this is what's happening now that we know of, what's happening that we don't know of. So I think your question is best answered by saying, it's not even about whether I think this could happen. This is already happening.
Monroe, Wisconsin. Mark, you're on the air.
Yes, my thought about this whole thing is artificial is also another name for substitute or replacement. I think this whole UN agenda is, in my opinion, the gateway to an artificial Christ, also known as the Antichrist, especially because of the increase of end-time deception and delusion.
Yeah.
And also, I think there could very well be a link to all this advanced technology intertwined with it that would be connected to the image of a false prophet that's referred to in Revelation 13.
Mark, thanks for raising that issue. Appreciate the call. I mean, it's Alex, it's all about deception, all about control.
It is, absolutely. And I think the caller just made such a fantastic point. Every Christian needs to be praying about these things, that God would give us wisdom in these times. We live in incredible, extraordinary times. The potential for winning souls is enormous. But we need to understand all these things, and we need to be watching, right? The Bible told us we need to be watching. We need to be paying attention. And so just thank you to the caller for bringing that up. I can't say that I understand all the implications of this, but I think we all need to be meditating on these things and praying for wisdom about them.
To the state of West Virginia. And Virginia, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi, how are you all? And praise the Lord for you.
Thank you for listening. What's on your heart today?
I saw a news program on, I believe it was CBS or ABC, just this past week, or it could be 2 weeks, I'm not really sure. But it was about an implant in the hand, a chip implant, where they can wave it over a snack machine and receive the goods.
Yes.
And so I heard they did that to the Navy already. They have tried that, but this was on national news.
And thank you, Virginia. We just talked about a company in Wisconsin that's implementing that with a number of employees. Do we know of any military application with that yet, Alex?
Years ago, I actually wrote an article about the U.S. Defense Department wanting to put these microchips in American troops. And I speculated in that article that this push, it was already becoming clear at that point. I can't remember if it was 5 or 6 years ago or whatever, but it was already becoming clear that this was a trend that was accelerating. And so I speculated that they might first start with, segments of the population that could not resist, right? Prisoners, soldiers under contract with the military, people like that, people who wanted to get out of jail and be able to walk around. They'd say, well, that's fine, but first we'll put a microchip in you. So they would start with those and then gradually move it out to broader and broader sections of the population. It's being marketed as a health thing, right? Well, just get a microchip, and then if you're ever in the hospital, we'll know your health information right away. And in Europe, they've actually tried to frame it as this kind of cool, hip, new thing. And to emphasize that, some of the nightclubs said, hey, you get yourself a microchip and you get instant access to the VIP lounge and you can pay for your drinks with your microchip and you don't have to show your ID to prove you're overage. So all different tactics, I think, will be tried to advance this. But again, America's a little bit behind the curve. In Scandinavia and parts of Western Europe, they're way ahead of us on the cashless society effort and the microchipping effort.
Wow. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you.
We've got Daniel next. Hi, Daniel. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you. I've wondered for some time that the reference in the book of Revelation to the beast, whether it had to do with a non-human entity or partial human entity. So I wondered if your guest could comment about that.
Again, I don't feel qualified to speak on those matters just because, it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I certainly think that it's plausible, and even stronger, I will say, we all need to be praying about these things, that God would give us the wisdom that we need, that He would make sure we understand what we need to understand when we need to understand it, because, we don't want to be deceived, and we need to be aware of these things. We need to be informing others about these things. So, again, unfortunately, I just don't feel qualified to speculate on that, but I think it's a very reasonable question. I think it's something we all ought to think about.
And thank you, Daniel. And Lord willing, next week, Wednesday, Ron Rhodes is scheduled to be with us and gets into, he's a biblical apologist, but also certainly looks at Bible prophecy, and he has just put forth a new book to show many of these things all coming together, certainly pointing us to the fact that the timing of the Lord's return is drawing near. We don't know the day nor the hour, but certainly we can be in observance of all these issues that are going on. Thank you so much. Courtney is next, Miami, Florida. Courtney, you're on the air.
God bless all you saints, and Mark had it just right. What we're seeing now is the Bible fulfilling itself in Satan in his last days. And all these different names of Julian and all that, this is just satanic forces fighting against good. And us Christians got to be witnessing, praying, and out there, those that can, winning souls for Christ, because this is our last chance that we're having. This is for the Gentiles and for the Jews, because when you read that Bible, you read Ezekiel, you read Isaiah, you read Jeremiah, you'll see just where we are in these days. Yeah. And I pray that all y'all, and I thank Mark for saying exactly what he said. God bless you all.
Thank you, Courtney. And, Scripture talks about redeeming the time because the days are evil. And certainly it is making wise use of our time. We have a purpose here, folks. It's not to sit back in our easy chairs. We are to be salt. We are to be light. And that's advancing the gospel, and it's also living the gospel, impacting our society around us as well. Appreciate the call. Let's pick up Holly in Venice, Florida. You're on the air, Holly.
Hi. I don't know if this is true. I wanted to thank you, by the way, for this program again. But I heard from someone else that they've already made a robot in another country where they had a shortage of labor because they cut back on the amount of children people could have. So they have a robot that's so lifelike, it blinks its eyes and everything and can do our jobs. What's going to happen in the future if we have these robots doing our jobs? What is everybody else going to be doing that can't operate a robot? And I'd just like to hear your opinion on that. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Holly. And Alex, this is that technology is there. We're seeing even these cities that have put in, or states or locales that have put in these minimum wage laws, $15 an hour. They're resorting to technology to take the place of human beings.
Oh, absolutely. It's happening already. I mentioned earlier in this program that there's already news articles being written by robots and computers. There are already very lifelike robots doing human jobs. And the establishment is already preparing people to accept this idea that, they call it the universal basic income, right? So when we're all out of a job because of robots, and, almost every field is affected by this. I'll pause and say, there's already robots doing surgery better than surgeons. There's already robots, doing legal research better than humans. So this is accelerating, and we must be ready.
We're going to take a quick break. Alex Newman is with us. TheNewAmerican.com is the website where you'll find his article on this and other issues. TheNewAmerican.com. Our number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. We'll be right back.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewtimes.com. We're continuing our series on why we need full-time apologists. We looked at last time we need full-time apologists to bring accountability to teachers and pastors and other ministry leaders that stray from the truth. And we looked at 1 Timothy 5:19. We also see in Galatians chapter 2 where Paul confronts Peter straight to his face, and it says in verse 14, I said to Peter, before them all. Paul confronts Peter before them all. Why? Because you cannot correct public false teaching privately. In addition, if it were not for some of these apologists that are watching what's going on within evangelicalism today, who would correct many of these so-called pastors or teachers that are embracing unbiblical theology and doctrine? We must do it in the right spirit, but we need apologists to bring accountability to teachers and pastors and evangelical leaders that stray from the truth.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Folks, this is not pretend. This is not make-believe. I mean, the UN had a conference June of 2017 on this, a global summit, Geneva, on artificial intelligence, saying it will change the way we shape our world. Further, then we have May of 2017, the month previous, this UN Office for Project Services hosting a summit on the whole aspect of the security implications of this artificial intelligence. And folks, they're looking for a director to head this up. We understand there are more meetings to come. Alex Newman is with us today. He's written on it, thenewamerican.com. Alex, as that break came upon us, I mean, that the caller had a very interesting question about, about the impact of robots and technology, even taking over in so many regards.
Yeah, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to pick back up there. In an ideal world, I don't think it would be any threat to us at all to have, technology helping people more and more to produce, a greater abundance of goods and services. And so obviously we don't want to lose track of what's important. But unfortunately, the way the economy is structured, I would argue that it's rigged in a very real sense. And so, they're promoting this hysteria, you're all going to lose your jobs because of robots. Okay. Historically, when people lose their jobs because of some new advance in technology, they just move into a new sector, and human well-being increases and prosperity increases. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen this time around, just because of the way the economy is being guided on these tracks, and I would argue very artificially. But so the solution that they're promoting, and if you look, a lot of these establishment conferences bringing together the elite of the global elite, they've been promoting this idea of a universal basic income. The idea is basically we'll give every citizen enough money from the government, of course, to basically survive. They'll be able to have a house and food and the things that they need, and then if they want to go above and beyond that, they can find other ways of earning money. The risk of this is that once everybody becomes dependent on the government, people are much more susceptible to being manipulated, to being threatened, to constantly expanding government, and to move in a very totalitarian direction. So I think people should be very aware of this. Just from a financial standpoint, you ought to be thinking about this, right? Are you positioned financially in a way to not get clobbered by these kinds of developments? But from a spiritual point of view, I think it's very important, again, for us to be praying about these things and asking God for wisdom in these just incredible, extraordinary times.
Our next caller is Kevin from Richland Center, Wisconsin. Kevin, you're on the air.
I guess what I was explaining was if you have looked at Arthur Clarke's book, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
What is
I know of it, but I have not read it.
Well, that's the same point he's making. When you watch that movie, what Clarke was writing, similar to Toffler, science fiction writers were warning about this even in that movie, because what a lot of people don't understand is the nature of thought is directed by God, but machinery has been notoriously antisocial all through history. When you take a look at the aspect of machinery, when you take a look at how machinery in a mass movement, from swords all the way to laser weapons and things that people don't understand, is how a machine overtakes the minds of people. And they don't understand it because they become too dependent on that. They don't understand what's going on with the machinery, because those that are manipulating the machinery want to see the people under the control of that machine.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me say this, Alex. There's actually a term that's used called a declaration of interdependence.
It is, and that's one of the terms that they've used to refer to the Agenda 2030. It's essentially a direct attack on our Declaration of Independence and the principles in it. The idea that it's a self-evident truth that we're all created, that we all have individual rights. Another term they use for this Agenda 2030 is the Master Plan for Humanity. And they've used this openly on many occasions. And the Chinese government actually came out talking about this Master Plan, and they boasted that they played a crucial role in developing it. So, we know who the architects of this were. We know how they're marketing it. We can actually read the document and see how just incredibly totalitarian the mindset that permeates it is. And, I think it should set alarm bells off ringing. And, to speak just very briefly on the last caller's comments, I agree entirely. And what we're dealing with now, I think, is just a whole other animal. It's beyond any kind of technology that we've had before where humans are really in control of it. Because now we're talking about technology that can learn on its own, that can improve itself, that can make decisions, that can literally make life and death decisions over, who survives, who dies, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's just, it's something, I think, so beyond what regular people think about and can even conceive of, that it just all, it sounds frightening and we don't want to deal with it, but we have to be thinking about these things because they are coming regardless of what we want. We can't bury our heads in the sand.
Thanks, Kevin. We're going to Ann in Menominee Falls. You're on the air.
Hi. I've seen a movie a long time ago regarding this artificial intelligence thing. And it was on this planet. I don't know if it was the United States or what, but nobody was allowed to live past the age of, say, like 29 or something.
Sure. And do you have a specific question about our topic? I mean, I know there's a lot of things that are out there in science fiction realm. We're talking reality. Yeah. This is really going on here.
Yeah, it's scary. I wonder if some guy at the UN also saw. No, I don't have a question for him.
Thanks, Ann. And there's a lot of this out there because many of you see the control that this is going to have. Let's pick up Donald in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon. First, I have a compliment for Alex. I have a copy of this book, Claims of Educators. Very great book regarding public schools. Secondly, there was mention of H.R. 193, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. I was contacted by a member of Congress on it. I'm looking at the summary right now. I see there's only 8 co-sponsors on a bill out of 435. Right. Yep. So I'd like for Alex to comment on why so few co-sponsors on the bill, even though it was introduced on Jan 3.
Yeah, thank you for that. Why so few co-sponsors and why no movement? I mean, it's been there since January 3rd of 2017.
Well, great question. Ed, thank you for the call and thank you for the nice words. I think the simple reason is that the American people have not become sufficiently outraged and sufficiently knowledgeable to move it forward, and the establishment will do everything to protect their baby, the United Nations. So they do not want, they don't want any attention on this. They don't want anyone thinking about it. And, I think a lot of lawmakers kind of, they get the gist when they get to Washington. You defy us on certain things, and, that'll cost you big if you want to advance politically and so on. So, it's very unfortunate that more members of Congress have not jumped on board. I know in the district where I spend a lot of time, the congressman has gotten an enormous amount of pressure from constituents, including, very influential constituents, businessmen, people in the Republican Party, and he still won't move on it. So it's a shame, but we need to keep working. Okay, again, the member of Congress can be reached at 202-225-3121, 202-225-3121. Find direct numbers at House.gov, Senate.gov. Alex Newman, our guest today. You can read the article at thenewamerican.com. Alex, thanks for keeping us informed on these vital issues. Thank you so much for having me, Jim. And folks, thanks for listening to Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.
Well, thanks.
With SRN News, I'm Rich Thomason in Washington. After only 11 days on the job, Anthony Scaramucci has been ousted as White House Communications Director.
Scaramucci was roundly criticized last week for a profane interview with The New Yorker during which he demeaned top White House aides.